Hello, everyone, and welcome to another emergency Zeteo Town Hall and the latest breaking news, which is, of course, Israel's massively escalatory attack on Iran last night. And this comes amidst what appeared like overtures by the Trump administration towards some sort of agreement of sorts, but that was quickly revealed to be anything but as Israel launched its massive assault, and as we watched the US response to it. The idea of mediation and negotiation seemed to quickly fizzle. All the while, Israel is, of course, continuing its brutal assault on Palestinians both in Gaza, even at the infamous so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and in the West Bank. As a reminder, we want to encourage you all to please share your questions with us in the question and answer section, and that's not the chat area. I know that can lead to some confusion, but again, the question and answer section. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We appreciate how many of you are joining us so on such short notice. And as always, we really appreciate your support, and please do continue to amplify our work. We appreciate your support in your subscriptions, and your readership, and the way that you're making sure that as many people as possible are reading our important journalism as well. But joining me now is Iranian-American academic Vali Nasr, who advised senior U.S. policymakers and served as senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. He's also the author of several books on the Middle East, including most recently, Iran's Grand Strategy and How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. Thank you so much, Valley, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank, thank you for inviting me. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So perhaps let's just start simply. How did we get here and what led to last night's attack?
So, I mean, there were two dynamics at play. One is that after Israel destroyed Hezbollah's leadership, and then after Iran lost Syria, there was an exchange of missiles that happened between Iran and Israel. Israel believed that it disabled a large number of Iran's air defense systems, that Iran was vulnerable, and that it saw a historic opportunity not only to downgrade Iran's military capabilities, damage or largely destroy its nuclear infrastructure, but perhaps even push Iran in the direction of regime change by decapitating its security and military structure. So this has been unfolding, if you say, from towards the end of the Biden administration to today. So this is one trajectory. The other one is the trajectory of nuclear negotiations, which President Trump suggested even before coming into office that he was more interested in that. He was not interested in Israel's military option first, no talks, but rather wanted to try diplomacy at first. And for a long time, we thought that diplomacy, even though that it was difficult, was still on the table. And neither side, neither the Iranians nor Americans, had declared that the talks had failed. They had major disagreement, but the talks were ongoing. And in fact, they were scheduled to meet on day after tomorrow on Sunday in Muscat for the sixth round of talks. And in the middle of this came the attack last night, which seemed to be that the Israeli game plan for managing Iran intervened or crossed over what was Trump's plan, which was he wanted to deal with the nuclear issue diplomatic. So this came as a surprise, not only to Iranians, but I think to all the observers, because they still expected that there was at least a few more rounds of back and forth on the diplomatic front before we would end up in a situation like this.
Thank you. And you talk about how Israel saw these conditions as an opportunity to strike to further dismantle Iran. Do you feel like it's just all gaslighting when they describe it, or when even the media describes it as preemptive? I mean, you think of Netanyahu's insistence of Iran being on the precipice of having a nuke since the early 90s. How do you sort of respond to this more fundamental question of why they struck and this idea that it was in any form preemptive?
Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
Well, I think generally Israel often characterizes its actions as preemptive, and it's not alone around the world. No country ever says that I am engaging in war for offensive purposes. Even, Putin going into Ukraine was defensive. He was defending against NATO. So I'm not surprised by that. That's political talk. But I think Israel, particularly coming out of the Gaza war, is overconfident, or let's say is very triumphant with its own military capabilities. So even before October 7th attacks, Israel had a tendency to see a military solution to all of its security challenges. And it's now doing so even more. And perhaps other countries being in its shoes would have done the same. It's obviously pulverized Gaza. It's pretty much decimated Hezbollah, and now it's been able to attack Iran with impunity in a situation where Iranian retaliation is neither here nor there. And so Israel sees that it has military advantage at this point, and it is very tempting for it to come to the conclusion that it should press its advantage and try to take the war to Iran while Iran is still shell-shocked with what happened in Lebanon, with loss of Syria, with the downgrading of its missiles, and still it does not have a real deterrent in the way North Korea has, as a robust nuclear program that you cannot just take out by airstrikes. So it's essentially arguing that I have the military capability, I'm already mobilized. They are basically like a boxer that has been punched it and it's on the ground. It's still shell shocked. It's a mistake to let it gain its consciousness. We should just go for the kill. Now, this obviously we knew was Israel's position for several months back. The key issue, what happened to President Trump, because he was not sold on this idea. He thought that it's too risky, that this may still end up in a much larger war, which then United States would have to fight for Israel. There's a significant portion of President Trump's base, the MAGA base, which is anti-war and has been resisting this idea that the United States should follow Israeli idea. So the key issue is what happened. And my sense is that President Trump decided that it's not diplomacy or war. He's going to use war as diplomacy. So because he can't get the Iranians to bend to their will, if he allowed Israel to carry out this attack, even downgrade Iran a bit, weaken it, bloody it, that then Iran would succumb to his demands at the negotiating table. I mean, after all, this is a strategy that he followed even in his first term with maximum pressure sanctions. I'm going to come out of the nuclear deal. I believe that if I put enormous amount of economic pressure on Iran, Iran will come on its knees back to the table and give me a much bigger deal than they gave to Obama. Now, this time, he probably is calculating that this attack will force Iran to give him the kind of a deal that he could claim that is much bigger than Obama's deal.
So to put a finer point on it, because you talk about this idea of diplomacy through war, but earlier you had mentioned this idea that there was this element of surprise with regards to, of course, the populist people generally, but of course as well to potentially different stakeholders in these negotiations. I wonder, Basil Hamdan submitted a question to us in which he asks whether the Witkoff negotiations were essentially just a ruse and whether it was sort of premeditated strategic deception while Israel and US laid the groundwork for this attack, or maybe perhaps to what you're getting at, was it sort of a more real-time adaptation and calculation? And I ask this especially because when we think about how the Trump administration has responded in the past 12 hours, they've kind of evolved how they've spoken on this. Initially before this, of course, we saw Trump insisting that they were committed to a diplomatic resolution, that they were looking forward to these negotiations this weekend. Shortly after the attack, Marco Rubio says that Israel took unilateral action, insisting that the US was not involved. He said Iran should not target US interests or personnel. But then over and over again, in the past 10 to 12 hours, Trump has gotten on the phone with several reporters, pretty much saying, oh, we knew it was going to happen, kind of gloating at the idea that, some Iranian hardliners were being a little too brave. They didn't know what was about to happen. They're all dead now. And so it seems as if he's evolved his messaging over time. So I'm wondering how you sort of square this. Like, do you
I
see
mean,
it?
that's the. No, I don't see. I can't say for sure that that's not true. But I would say that if your plan was to hit Iran all along, you would have done it much earlier, because all this time you've also given Iran more time to enrich more, prepare more, build more capability. If the Israeli theory was that they destroyed Iran's air defense systems, months ago, why not, attack Iran much sooner? So it could be a ruse, or it could be, as I said, it's a tactic because Trump realized that he's not going to get his way with the Iranians that easily. But the fact that the president is undisciplined in messaging is not new. I mean, what Secretary Rubio said is probably what a diplomatic message is that, maybe privately they knew, they privately gave the green light, but you come out and say, oh, we had nothing to do with it because there was no American flag on the planes that actually dropped the bombs, and these was over Israel, and we were surprised and they didn't consult us. And this is what you would basically say. And the US has said this many, many times over the years, including when Israel hit Iran with missiles the previous time. The Americans said the same thing. We had no involvement in the Israeli operation against Iran. But the president then cannot help himself. It's true of many other issues with China, with Russia, with trade, etc. He veers off. But what he said actually to me sounds a lot more like he's trying to relate this attack to where the negotiations were. There were hardliners that wouldn't get it, that they should have signed this deal sooner, that they shouldn't have dragged their feet, that they should have accepted my terms. Now, Israel can do a lot more harm to you, and you should now come to the table and basically accept my terms and do it soon in order to avoid more bad things happening to you. So, so it seems like his goal is not necessarily, it's still to get the deal that he wants. And I think so my read of it is that either way, America was not surprised. The Israel's role here is basically an instrument in what Trump wants to happen. Of course, as far as Israel is concerned, this is exactly what they wanted to do all along. But I'm not sure that the reason why they did the bombing is exactly the same reason as why Trump allowed them to do the bombing.
And so how has Iran responded up to this point in the recent hours, and what might be the extent of their response? What capabilities do they have? And furthermore, an attendee asks, what countries might be inclined to show any type of support to Iran as they think about their response?
I think this is to your last. I think more countries are going to support Israel. In other words, when Israel is attacking Iran, it's doing it unilaterally, it's doing it on its own. But when it comes to Iran's retaliation, as we saw last time, then the United States, Arab countries, European countries, etc., are going to do everything they can to shoot down Iranian missiles or dissuade Iran from doing it. Yes, there are countries who might give Iran diplomatic support, but that's the extent of it, including Russia, China, etc. There's no material military support for Iran. Iran made a show of sending hundreds of missiles early on, but that's not the real retaliation. First of all, I have to say the Iranians are shell-shocked. They didn't expect it coming. 3 of the 4 or 5 top commanders of the Revolutionary Guard have been killed. This has been a massive blow to them. Israel, as we're talking, is continuing its attacks now, also targeting missile batteries, etc. So I don't think the Iranians need to get their bearings first before they decide what do they do. Secondly, there's not a straight path in front of it. They can try to retaliate against Israel in a big way, but then they have to calibrate. Would the United States try to shoot down a lot of those missiles? I mean, there's no point for them to launch 3,000 missiles and 90% of them are shot down. If they're going to retaliate against Israel, they need the retaliation to create some degree of deterrence. In other words, it has to be serious enough to then change the calculation as it stands at this moment. But then that also risks an escalation into a much larger war. because a serious attack on Israel will invite an Israeli retaliation, then Iran has to retaliate again. And at some point, this will involve the United States. And then, then you run an escalatory cycle. And the Iranians have to be very careful about that. The other issue is that can they have a response at a lower level where they are providing a response, but they don't necessarily get entangled into an escalatory ladder with the US and Israel. But it's not clear what that would be. What should they do that looks like a serious retaliation, create some deterrence, but then does not invite an escalation into a full-blown war? But I think the Iranians also realize that in a way, what they expected out of a nuclear deal with Trump is no longer there. Trump is now not expecting a deal, he's expecting a surrender, which the Iranians, I don't think, want to do. The question for them becomes, how do they manage a situation in which the Europeans are likely now to put sanctions on Iran following the IAEA report that came out a few days ago censuring Iran? That the United States is now okaying military campaign against Iran, whether it's by Israel or by itself. That Iran is going to be more isolated, is being pushed in the direction that Iraq was in the 1990s. And so I think the issue of retaliation is important, but the issue of managing what looks like a whole new challenge before them is even more significant for them.
Hmm. And you talk about obviously these layered calculations that the Iranians have to grapple through. Abi Abdul Wahhabi kind of brings us to ask what sort of calculus Arab countries and other countries in the region also have to sort of grapple through in terms of intervening, responding. What do you think they're kind of thinking about as they sort of have to respond to this or are faced with pressure from their people to respond to this?
Well, I don't know what pressure they will feel from their people, but I mean, the initial response that they had, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., all condemned Israel's attack. At some level, they will seek to protect the relationship they have with the US, or kind of, let's say, the cold or the open or closed peace they have with Israel. I don't think they're trying to get in the middle of this. But there are two significant issues for them. One is that this conflict, if it gets out of hand, it will end up on their shores. Israel, after all, is far away from Iran, but UAE, Saudi Arabia are just 100 kilometers from Iran's borders. The US bases that would attack Iran, other than Diego Garcia in the middle of Indian Ocean, are all a large number of them are around the Gulf. And the Gulf countries have for a while understood that a war with Iran ultimately will impact their economies, will impact their economic development policies, it will impact their service industries. It's not like they could be immune to it. There's no such thing as a clean war with Iran. And so they're nervous. In fact, that's the whole reason why they've been normalizing with Iran all along. That's why they've been supportive of a nuclear deal, because they don't want war in their neighborhood. But I want to venture to say that they're also getting increasingly nervous about the idea of having one superpower in the Middle East in the name of Israel. Because Israel is emerging out of the Gaza war as an uber military power, which is unrestrained. It's unrestrained in its own mind in how much and how it exercises military capability. It is unrestrained by Europeans, and it's not restrained by Europeans, and it's not restrained by the Americans. And if Israel crushes Iran, then basically the Arabs would have to deal with an Israeli superpower. Arabs were not happy with Iranian hegemony. They resisted it in the decade ago of Iran becoming a dominant power in the region. I don't think they're comfortable with Israel also becoming an unquestionable military power in the region. It does present them with a lot of problems, particularly in light of the Gaza war, in light of where the populations are. So they're very nervous about, where does the dust settle on this thing? In war or in a peace in which Israel will emerge as the singular superpower in the region.
Now, I'm curious, I would like to take us to the American side of things for a moment. Of course, there's this infamous video that goes around every so often of Netanyahu himself in 2002 urging the US to invade Iraq. And I'm 26 years old. I have getting so much flashbacks throughout my entire life of this appetite for war that has just subsumed America. And so I think Neged Khan kind of introduced us to a very basic question that I think is instructive, which is why is there no international condemnation from the West about another war started by Israel?
It's a very good question. I mean, in a way, actually, whatever we think of the MAGA movement and Trump, it at least looked like the MAGA movement at its heart is anti-war. That in fact, one of its major messages was that, wars are costly or useless. We should focus on development in America. Even as we're talking, somebody like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has been quite vociferous in opposition to a war with Iran. But I think the dynamic of this idea of having a military solution to all the problems in the Middle East is pretty strong. And I think the narrative that Israel has about settling these problems with Iran, with Hezbollah, with Palestinians, etc., militarily, has a great deal of resonance in important both intellectual, media, and political sectors in the United States. So, and the Europeans largely basically take their cue from the US. So whatever they might think privately, there is no open condemnation of this. And then on the other side of it, unlike hapless Palestinian civilians, Iran has not presented a very sort of lovable, sympathetic view of itself over the years, right? So it makes it easier to say, well, this is a government that supported terrorism. This is a government that even the Arab population stood opposed to. It's now even doesn't have the love of its own people, and so that makes it easier to make this into a black and white, good and evil fight, and then to say, you can't talk to it, you can't resolve this issue. Let's just go to war.
And so, under that possibility of full-on war, let's say, Carlene Joseph asks us, if Israel continues to attack Iran, do you think there will be reason to put American boots on the ground? Will America get fully involved in this?
It could. I mean, I think President Trump is probably more averse to war than if the Democrats, for instance, if there was a President Harris. I actually think the Democrats would resist war even less than Republicans would right now. And that's largely because of the sentiment at the core of the MAGA movement, which is anti-war. But the reality is that if Americans get killed, if something happens that was an American pilot, Americans in a base, etc., get killed, I think it'd be very difficult for President Trump not to get involved. So the danger of the gamble that is taken, that I'm going to use the Israeli attack because I think the Iranians are going to crawl on their knees and sign a nuclear deal, is that he may lose control of this escalation. Iranians may retaliate in a way that then the Israelis retaliate, and then the Iranians retaliate. And before you know it, the United States gets sucked in. And whether it gets sucked in immediately in the next few months, or like with the case of Iraq, it takes a number of years before we get sucked in. But we're looking at another Iraq scenario. Unless there is an off-ramp here. And I'm hoping that President Trump, just like he showed with the Houthi campaign, and he started the war in Yemen and then he backed off, that he quickly realizes that this can get off the rails, and he should not let the escalation begin to unfold the way that we might perceive.
A viewer named Patricia Green, I think, really underscores this notion of just familiar patterns and how Israel has taken advantage of a country's weakness, and how Israel and of course other entities in the West are always pushing for this regime change. Do you think, given how expansive we've seen Israel's activities over the past 20 months, not only in Palestine, but in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and so on, would Netanyahu really be satisfied with any regime if there were to be a regime change?
I don't know. I don't think the issue for Israel is what replaces the Islamic Republic. Just like the issue for them was not what replaced Assad or what replaces Hezbollah. The issue is that they want to do away with the current regime that they see as hostile. And they were opposed to Saddam. That's why, as you mentioned, Netanyahu advised with the war. But what replaced Saddam doesn't really bother them. First of all, in a way, Israel's foreign policy is cleaner than the US's, because US always gets bogged down in democracy and human rights, and this has a sort of a right side of his brain, left side of his brain that complicates things. Israelis have a much clearer sense of what's their national security. National security, they're a small country in the middle of 200 million Arabs. There should not be any power that actually threatens them. There should not be any military force that can threaten them. And if there is one, they should destroy it. And it's a question of, can they destroy it? And now they actually feel that there is a moment where their ability to destroy their enemies is at its peak. And therefore, they're exercising that. Now, what replaces these regimes? Unlike the United States, they're not sort of woolly-brained about, we're going to create nation building and there's going to be a democracy, etc. For them, Iraq is a lot less threat to Israel than it was under Saddam. Syria is a lot less threat to Israel than it was under Bashar Assad or under Hafez Assad. When Syria was actually in civil war and even ISIS was running around, it was less of a threat to Israel than when the Assad family was ruling. And so I don't think the concern is what replaces the Islamic Republic, rather than the fact that a coherent military political force that can organize a region-wide challenge to Israel in the form of Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, etc., that is capable of building ballistic missiles that can reach Israel, that is capable of building a massive nuclear industry that can very easily produce nuclear weapons, that is the threat. What replaces it is not a concern so long as it does not pose these same very threats to Israel.
Kevin Brand asks us about I think, what we've seen over the past 20 months, especially the act of bombing residential buildings with the purpose of killing individuals with expertise or roles that Israel deems to be threatening to them. That seems to be like this worrisome extension of a precedent that they've played out over and over again in Gaza and Lebanon, as we've seen. Do you see this as the new normal of how they operate? And furthermore, another anonymous attendee asks, given that behavior, is there a realistic scenario in which NATO countries or the West sanction or respond to Israel? Would it take Israel nearly using its arsenal?
I don't see that, because that arsenal is actually provided by these very countries. I mean, if the very first step is to say, I'm not Germany, France, United States, if they don't see a problem giving the weapons, they cannot sanction Israel for actually using the weapons that they're giving Israel. So no, I do not think that's the case. I think the playbook is actually much older. I mean, there's a very good book on the history of Mossad. It's called something like Rise and Kill Them First. And actually, it does narrate that how Israel killed Egyptian nuclear scientists in the 1960s. How they, for instance, a very famous case you may remember, that Saddam Hussein was trying to build a super gun, a sort of a massive tube that went hugely out of the ground that could shoot a missile at Israel. And the Israelis assassinated the scientist that was behind it. So this actually has been there. Now, targeting civilians is maybe something newer that's coming out of Gaza. But this idea that Israel preemptively tried to deny first Arab countries, then Iran, of having capability to build weapons or nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons that could be a threat to Israel, actually goes back to the 1950s and 60s.
Throughout this conversation, there's been this discussion about timing and opportunity. And Latifa Faisal, she asks if you think whether Israel felt that the global sentiment towards the genocide in Gaza was shifting. So they took this moment to instigate this war and thus force the US and encourage the US to continue to provide weapons and re-ramp up its support to Israel. Do you feel like they felt that?
I I don't think the issue of public opinion is as important to them as the issue of the national security threat that they are preoccupied with. I mean, look at it this way. Yes, they don't like criticism by ICC, ICJ. When you or other journalists criticize them, they react very, very strongly. But at the same time, it is not Iran for which they are bleeding reputation. It is over the Palestinian issue. And you could also say that the reputation at this point in time is a sunk cost. Whether they attack Iran or not attack Iran, it's not going to make a difference to public opinion around the world. And you could even say that they may calculate that, look, we've already assumed the opprobrium of the world against our behavior. So we may as well, as I said, press our advantage at this moment in time. But I also think that, whether they bomb buildings in Gaza, starve the Palestinians, etc., is perhaps something they can debate more, because the threat of Palestinians to Israel the threat of Hamas is really gone. It's a question of how far do they want to push this issue with Gaza and the West Bank. But Iran is a real threat to them. I mean, they do believe that Iran has missiles that are capable of hitting Israel. They do believe that Iran is actually sees itself as Israel's adversary in a way that no Arab state now does. Arab states are either friends or they're neutral. There's nobody who's building an army to go to war with Israel anymore. So Iran is the only country that's an adversary, and Iran is a big country. It has capability, it has smart people. It's capable of building its own missiles, its own nuclear program, etc. So it's not like Israel is imagining a threat from Iran and acting on it. So the threat from Iran is real, except I think at this point in time, Israel believes that it has the opportunity and the means to change the balance of power between Israel and Iran in a decisive way in favor of Israel, at whatever cost it is. And if it escalates into something bigger, or it causes massive chaos in Iran, or a lot of Iranians die, I think that those are costs that they're perfectly happy to assume at this point in time.
Ali, as we reflect on the horrors we have already seen, and as we're on the precipice potentially of even more, several of our attendees and readers have asked, what can they do? How can the American people respond? How can Israel be held account? What can be done to prevent escalation, to hold Israel accountable, to stop even more horrors from happening?
Well, ultimately, it's American politicians that make those decisions. So the real question comes down to what do American politicians hear from American public? I mean, the bizarre thing for me in the past few months is that the only American politicians who've been talking against the war with Iran have been the MAGA ones. The Democrats, by and large, are silent, and then you could say the progressives have been focused on Gaza, not on Iran. But how far this goes? Can they really influence the administration? To what extent? These are all interesting questions. But maybe even Israel's calculation is that the mood of the American public is changing, both because of the progressive side and because of the MAGA side. And that maybe suggests to them that the window is even narrower. They don't have a long-term window because in 2 years' time, that window may be closing. And so you could also say that they have pressed much further. I mean, I really don't have a silver bullet answer as to, what can we do? But I know that, all Americans ultimately have to, in a democracy, talk to their representatives and ask of them and tell them that this is a priority. And I know we're also in a time period that issue of war with Iran has to compete with other urgent matters, like ICE and immigration, or protest in California, or a whole host of trade and domestic and other sets of issues. But ultimately, that's the way in which politics in America is formed.
Well, we have to leave it there. Vali, firstly, thank you so much for sharing your time with us on such short notice. Everyone who's attending and watching right now, we appreciate you tuning in, sharing all your questions. You had so many great ones, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We just had to respect Vali's time here. But thank you seriously so much for your insight. We appreciate it. And once again, for everyone listening, we appreciate your support so much. We're trying our best at Zeteo to do important, investigative, frank, clear, and honest work that honors you as a reader. And respects you as someone who wants to know more about the world. And we want to keep doing that. So please continue to support us, subscribe to us, tell your friends, family, neighbors, people you know, people you don't know, people you disagree with to support our work and help us, create a world of journalism that holds the power to account. So thank you so much. Thank you, and Vali. We appreciate you so much. And we hope all of you
Thank you.
take care and stay safe.
Thanks very much.